This is my friend Ethan, and he's come first in my medical school multiple years in a row, winning several awards over multiple different subjects. He's done all of this while having a social life and overall being a great guy. And he's recently also started a YouTube channel. So in this video, I'm gonna sit down and have a nice long chat with him about exactly what he did to be so successful in medical school. This video is packed with amazing insights, not just into medical school, but life. So sit down, take some notes, and enjoy.
So before we start, can you tell us a bit about yourself?
Yeah, so I'm Ethan. I'm a 5th year medical student with Emil here. And I basically started off, in this new world of med with a bunch of other really intelligent people and a bit lost with the different way of studying. This was a lot different to how I'd managed in school, where I could sort of get ahead with textbooks and tutors and in a new world. And yeah, since then I've tried a bunch of different strategies out and ended up doing pretty well. And now I have my own channel where I share some of the strategies that got me there.
Thanks for coming on, Ethan.
Pleasure.
So we'll just get started basically with the first question, which is, how did you study?
I think the way I study has changed year on year. It started off with pages and pages of notes and boring mind reading through it, and now has shifted towards more of a active recall and spaced repetition approach. But essentially it has to be a combination of efficient, fun, and quick for me. So currently I think about what content I need to learn and use a combination of the AI and some internet resources to essentially copy and paste a string of notes. And so from learning about certain conditions, I'll essentially get the AI to generate or copy and paste short notes on the most basic concepts for those conditions, then review them periodically, perhaps every month or two, and then in the background do flashcards and practice questions to fill in the gaps in my knowledge.
Okay, that's interesting. You mentioned the AI, like what AI do you use?
There's different ones for different purposes. I think if I want to learn about a new topic, Perplexity is my favorite because they will cite in the different websites where they get their information from, and you can really easily click the link and follow and do your own reading. When I'm asking it to explain the result of the practice question or to explain why certain things are right or wrong, I like Copilot just because it's a bit faster and more efficient. But I think some combination of both of those would make up the mainstay of my use.
Where do you usually get your resources from, the original base resource that you start studying from?
It depends really on what aspect of the course I'm studying. I like up to date for the medical things, but the downside is American, I think. So some of the management principles are outdated. We've got ETG, which is good for management. Past student notes are sometimes a reasonable place to look for. And then other common medical student resources like Radiopedia, Life, and the Fast Lane. So it depends on the specific topic, but some recognized evidence-based source and not some sketchy med student website.
So if you were to break down the studying that you do in a week, how would you go about doing that?
I think in first and second year it was a bit more tricky because they would only give you your lectures at the start of the week, and now in years 3 to 5, when you have a preset syllabus that you need to learn about and conditions you need to know about by the end of the year, you have a lot more flexibility and autonomy with how you construct your schedule. I'm a big fan of getting ahead and doing some practice in the holidays. So really in the holidays I'll try and make my notes and learn about the different topics, and then week to week I'm probably just doing revision, Anki, and practice questions. And so I sort of split up how much I'm studying day to day between those three. I like doing Anki almost opportunistically on my phone or when I have some free time, and you can I sometimes do my revision of the Notion stuff in the car just to save some time as well, or when I get home. But generally I think a typical day for me last year would have been sort of 30 minutes Anki, 30 minutes Notion, and 30 minutes practice questions. Generally when I get home or early morning if I've got a day off, and then on the busier days I can do the Anki almost at breaks during placement, and then do the revision in the car to and from placement, and then it's just the practice questions I have to do.
That makes a lot of sense. So with the revision that you do, what do you actually do in that time?
It's honestly probably not as high tech as it seems. I will have pre-written a set of notes on that condition, and I'm essentially just talking to myself and trying to recite as much of those notes as I can remember, almost giving a lecture on the topic to myself. And then after I've recited that, I will then just go through the notes and check what I've missed. and anything I missed, I will then make onto a flashcard on Anki. And so essentially, it's a bit tedious to say all these things to yourself, and sometimes you lose your train of thought if you're just internalizing the voice. So I often do speak it out loud, and sometimes writing it down, even if I'm just scribbling things, can sort of help. And so essentially for every condition, I will either give a speech or write a brief page on what I can remember about it.
So then are all of the Anki cards that you make made by yourself, or do you get pre-made decks as well?
Yeah, it's becoming one of the hotly debated questions in med to use the pre-made Anki decks or the self-made ones. I personally like the self-made ones because I know from the start what was on there, and I find it easier to learn that. Whereas from other people's cards, I often struggle with how many new ones to start with and just to download them, and you might get like 200 or 2,000 in a deck, and then you're unfamiliar with people's specific words or lingo that they use. So even though I make my own cards, all of them are basically copy and pasted or screenshots. And so I don't really spend any time making the cards because it's just Control-C, Control-V. They're either copy and pasted from my Notion notes, which are copy and pasted themselves from the AI or a website, or the cards are screenshots of practice questions I've gotten wrong.
I guess then you have a lot of stuff that you're copying, pasting, and then doing with your Anki. Do you find that when you learn things for the first time and then you're revising them that you've forgotten things, and like how do you deal with that?
Yeah, I think there's no chance that you'll remember everything you learn the first time. And as you mentioned in previous videos with the forgetting curve, you can only sort of expect to try and retain some level of information. There's different ways you can retain more. So I try and think of every condition as a story and imagine patient in that setting. And so that sort of helps me with the flow of information. But the first time I review it, there'll always be things that I miss. And that's why I will basically take those and put them on the Anki and then review them more commonly or more frequently than if I just had them on the Notion repeatedly reviewing.
I think one of the big problems in med school is that there's just so much content to cover. And it can be really hard to decide what you want to cover first and what's most important. And I know some people say you should study what you'll be on placement for first, and other people say you should study what you're being taught first. So firstly, how do you go about studying everything? And then how do you also decide what you want to study first?
Yeah, I think you have to make a decision early on about what you want to know and what you don't want to know, because there's always these details that will take you so long to learn which aren't relevant. I remember early on sort of reading these textbooks that were prescribed, and they were just going into all these ridiculous level of depth about anatomical variants of veins in the arm and things that never came up and now I've forgotten. And so I really try and learn what would I sort of in 5 years time think is important to learn, what's going to be on my exam, and what might help me gain more from this placement experience. And so I think it's good to do some pre-learning before your rotation, but one fallacy I think lots of people get into is only learning before their rotation. So in 4th year, for example, when you have 4 rotations, peds, GP, psych, women's, and if people have women's last, they're only learning the women's conditions 8 weeks out before their exam. I still think you want to start all of them early on and have some spaced repetition and reps throughout the year, but maybe you prioritize learning whatever's your first rotation first, and then during that you can then learn some of the other ones. But you want to focus on something that is simple enough and has the least amount of detail as possible, where you can still get the important ideas. What is the definition of that condition? How does it present? How do you diagnose it? How do you treat it? And then thinking about what will you actually need to know on the exam. So all med student questions are basically like, what's the diagnosis? What's the next best test? Or what's the next step in the management? And so you don't really need to know anything more than those things on your first layer of learning. And then if you do decide to learn more, I think the times I do are based on interest, or when things generally, it helps make sense of links between the two things. Why is this investigation best, or why is this management best? Well, we have to do this to prevent this particular complication, or these symptoms occur because of this particular part of the pathophysiology. And so you actually don't need to learn that much, because you're only going to answer 200 questions ultimately. So if you had this golden ball that told you these are the 200 areas you need, you could just focus on the high yield areas there. But ultimately, we can't tell exactly what's on the exam, and we want to learn a bit more for future years and in terms of linking and ruling things out as well. But starting with what's on the exam, what do students in years above you think is relevant, and what do you actually want to learn and remember in 2 or 3 years time.
So this question might be a bit targeted, but I think it helps to actually really get down into the nitty-gritty of what it is that you do. So I know that a lot of students actually write notes and also use Anki as well, whereas your results have been, quite good and better than a lot of them. So what do you think it is that makes your system or the things that you're doing different from what they're doing?
I think just constantly trying new things out and being willing to change is probably the first part. So I honestly think if I swapped strategies with someone else and used someone's strategy and they used mine, that they would probably beat me in the exams. And so the important things, I think most people don't get enough volume of practice questions in. I honestly think if you graph the number of practice questions that someone did and their performance on the exam, that would be correlated. So start practice questions early and get as much reps in as possible. Then anything you get wrong on the practice question is a gap in your knowledge. And so you need to address that somehow, being that with, flashcard or repeat practice question. Those two areas, I think if people focus more on, and instead of like notes and learning and teaching, people would do better at. And so I'm honestly, even though I've done a lot of note taking in the past, moving away from writing my own notes or even revisiting the notes and just moving towards lots of flashcards and lots of practice questions, just constantly testing yourself on certain things. And so I think people can get into the trap of spending a lot of time learning, watching lectures, writing notes, and that eats away at their time of actually doing practice questions and testing yourself. Because there's a certain direction of knowledge that you will use when you write your notes. So you might write it out saying, this is adenomyosis and these are the symptoms. But in the actual exam, they're going to give you the symptoms and you're going to have to tell which of these 5 conditions it is. And so practicing with practice questions actually going in the reverse direction is probably a good way of spending your time and balancing any time you spend making notes.
That makes a lot of sense, and that's very interesting as well. I guess one thing that you mentioned quite a lot is practice questions. So what are some of the practice questions, banks, resources that you use?
So there's free ones and paid ones. I always stick to the free ones. And so I found the best ones are Geeky Medics is pretty good. You probably have, I think, few hundreds, if not thousands of questions there. eMedici, the uni provides for us, but that used to be free. That's honestly one of the harder question banks I've done, but they're good case-based questions. Past Medicine, pretty good as well. And honestly, if you just search up like free med student practice questions, now there's a bunch of AI generated question banks that are coming up. And if you just get a sense, I think generally you want to get 80 to 90% of things correct. I probably wouldn't hit that on eMedici, for example. So as long as you're not getting below 50% and completely demoralized, or you're getting 100% and it's way too easy, just do as many questions as you can from online. So before an exam, I will try and finish all the questions relevant to that on Geeky Medics, Past Medicine, eMedici. And having seen all those questions before, there's a high chance that the questions they give on the exam I would have already seen in some capacity. And if I've got them wrong, I'll have them on my flashcards and have done them at least 5 times ready for the exam.
Yeah, so that makes a lot of sense. And you mentioned there that like some people might be getting lower scores in their practice exam. So if someone's getting like 50% on these practice questions, they don't really know where they're supposed to find the right answers, what would you say those people need to do?
Yeah, so sometimes when I do a question, there's 5 answer options, but you can tell 3 of them are not right and you're just tossing up between 1 or 2, or you feel like you have some sort of knowledge about the topic and it's just the last bit you need to know. In that case, maybe just simply making that practice question into a flashcard is okay. But sometimes I read a question and I'm like, I genuinely have no idea what the answer is. All these terms are new, all these drugs are confusing. I have no idea which of these conditions it is. And that is a hint to do some sort of deep dive on that question. So what I'll generally do in that case is take a screenshot or copy that question onto Perplexity and then try and get it to explain, like in a thorough comparison, list all the similarities and differences between all these answer options, teach me about this topic, and maybe there's something in terms of principles or first principles that you need, rather than just straight away moving that question onto Anki. And so based on how comfortable you are with that particular question, you can use the questions to then do further reading, whether that be online or via AI, to help you have a bit more knowledge about that topic. And then the next time you do the question on a flashcard, try and present what you already know, or with the new information, try and make that into flashcards as well.
We've talked a lot about studying, and that kind of makes me think, like, how much would you spend on average studying in a week or on a day, for example?
Generally, on a placement day, I try and keep it to 1 to 2 hours. And then on a day off, I have a bit more time. So maybe I'll use the morning for studying. That might be 2 to 3 hours. It depends on the proximity to the exams. So the last month before exams is essentially cram time, and I'm just doing as many questions as possible. And so then it's just whenever I have free time, I will try and put it into the exams. But most days during the semester, I'm trying to fill out, essentially my time goes to friends and family, then any hobbies, events, and then it's just the in-between time really that I can spend some time with practice questions and studying. But I try and keep it to an hour or two a day, and I have sort of lists and quotas about the things I want to get done.
Nice, that's good. And how do you find keeping yourself consistent with that?
I try and set small achievable goals that I want to do every day. I try and start early. So I think one thing that everyone can do is really before the semester starts is just commit to doing 10 or 20 practice questions a day. And then by the time you'll do the exam in, let's say, 300 days time, you've done 3,000 to 6,000 questions. And then with those 3,000 to 6,000 questions, if you then focus on the ones that you've got wrong and have them in flashcards, there's a high probability that out of those 6,200 will be ones that you know. And so I enjoy the questions. That's probably one thing that matters. If I didn't have a limited amount, I would probably do more, but sometimes I run out of questions and then I don't know where to get more questions. And so trying to gamify things, I think. So trying to, if my sort of average drops by 1 when you have that metric, then I'll try and keep practicing until I get it up, or till I get 5 in a row or 10 in a row. And just having some fun with those systems. Imagining you're on, Who Wants to Be a Millionaire, and you need to get the next 5 right to get the jackpot. Just having fun and trying to gamify things and thinking of it like a quiz, competing against your friends, are always, I think, to make it a bit more enjoyable.
Have there ever been times where you've been burnt out, and how have you dealt with that?
I think there's many different forms of burnout that people describe. Certainly one that seems to be common is this chronic lack of enjoyment and loss of energy. To me, when I feel overworked or burnt out, it's generally quite a short-term thing, and generally occurs when I've taken on way too much. And it's always been self-inflicted and hasn't always been med related. It's always when I try and do med with other things and additional things on the side. So you have a couple of events on the weekend, and I'm trying to make 5 new YouTube videos, and I'm doing some tutoring, and I'm doing study. And when that happens, it's really weird because I just can't concentrate in the same way. I find that I'm not efficient at all. I get headaches and fatigue quite easily and earlier in the day. And then to me, that's just a time just to take a day off, watch a movie. I generally will try and manage it with time with friends, time in nature, and then time resting. So it's just a good indication for me to sleep early. Sometimes it's at 8 o'clock on extreme day. And then I'm happy just to do no studying from that point, do no work, and just enjoy myself and relax. Have a nice meal, have an early night, and try and go for a walk outside as well.
So one thing that we haven't talked about yet is placement. And do you have any tips about making placement useful or helping people learn more from placement?
So there's tips that have been given to me that I don't follow, and there's tips that I would suggest people use. I think you have to determine what you really want from placement. If you asked, is placement the best place or area to study for exams? No, in my experience. I can get a lot more done at home learning about the conditions than I can learning about them in placement. Do you get a different side that will help with your memory? Yeah. So when you see people, when you take a history from a patient with a certain condition, those are experiences that will help your memory and will help your learning a lot. Is it the most efficient use of your time though? No. But I think when I look back in the last 3 years of placement's a really good idea to have conversations with doctors about what it's like being a doctor, what the future holds for that specialty of interest, why did they go into that specialty. It's really good for practicing patient-centered skills like histories, procedures, examinations, seeing the signs for yourself. So you can learn all about what the difference is between an ejection systolic murmur and a pansystolic murmur, but you'll always lose to the person who just goes every day and listens to everyone's hearts on the ward. So it's really good for the practical skills, for the exposure and connection with doctors, to be able to ask them questions in clinics or on the rounds. So it will give you good ideas on what you should be learning, on what's high yield, on what's frequent and prevalent. And even though it can be tedious and seem like you're a fly on the wall, you have to choose what you want to go into ultimately. And I think when I look back and say, I had this rotation, but I could have made more of my time there and gotten experience with that, because now I'm sort of have to choose what I think I want to do and placement is a really good opportunity just to see what you want to do and what you don't want to do, and get a flavor for that on a different rotation. And I guess the earlier you can rule in and rule out certain things, the more beneficial it is for you down the line too. In terms of like practical things you can do to get more out of placement, I'd say number one is carry around some sort of pen and notepad and write down anything that you see that you have questions about, that you want to learn about later, and that you can ask the consultant or doctors about. Then, you know, it's a good idea to try and seek out opportunities to learn. Ask the nursing staff if there's any cannulas or procedures available. Try and ask if you can present a patient, or sort of keep track of one patient on the ward rounds, or make the calls for that patient. Then as the doctor is sort of talking to the patient, note the particular phrasing that they use, because the words and the way that the consultants will phrase things after years of practice are things that you can essentially copy and use into your own histories and examinations. So how do they ask about confusion? How do they ask about sensitive questions? And finally, use the breaks to try and do some other work. So, you know, if there's a gap for 10 minutes, you know, you can get your Ankis out. If there's a gap, you can always be writing down about some condition that you learned about last night, and then getting some reps in for your active recall. So you can always fill in the time rather than just standing there, which we sometimes do. If you have some way of capturing things and writing things down, you can fill in the gaps.
I guess with all that all those things kind of apply as well, but what advice would you give to someone who's maybe struggling to get something out of their placement experience?
I mean, one thing we haven't talked about yet is, if it's not beneficial for you, you can always try and do something about it. So if you've fulfilled your obligations with the team, don't be afraid to go home and try and learn about topics in a different way on your own. I think there's ways where you can get exposure to different rotations, organize swaps with colleagues, or through the uni. They're always good ideas. Unfortunately, sometimes you just get teams where it feels like sometimes you don't exist and you're really like a nuisance to be there. And sometimes the doctors will look after you and it'll feel great, and you think, I've never gotten teaching this good before. So it is a bit hit and miss. I think if things aren't aligned in your favor, you do have to just fulfill your obligations to the course. But once those are met, prioritize yourself, think what's most beneficial for you, take things into your own hands as well. I think don't wait for people to ask you questions. You can always ask questions. Don't be afraid to follow up afterwards with patients and ask to listen to their hearts, lungs, or ask some basic history questions, and perform the examinations on them soon after the consults is something that you've mentioned in the past as well. So you have to make do, but I think often the times where it's not a pleasant experience as a student is where you can sometimes branch out and have a bit more autonomy in how you conduct your placement experience. Whereas the times where the consultant's teaching you a lot and it's a really good experience are the times where you're happy to sort of stay at the back of the room and just learn things passively.
Yeah, I completely agree with that as well. And I find that sometimes it's just unavoidable that things end up being not that productive for you as a student. And that's understandable because it's a busy hospital. People are doing their thing. But I think taking things into your own hands at those times is definitely a good thing to do. Let's move on to some general things that medical students often struggle with as well. And I know that you've achieved a lot of really, really amazing things in med school, but do you ever deal with imposter syndrome yourself?
I think moving to a new school in year 9, I definitely felt it. When you go to a selective school, everyone there is there because they're smart and because they can compete, and it sort of feels like, how did I get into this? I think once I reached med school, it did feel everyone there seemed really on the board. Everyone was organized and studying, and I think having not done high school biology, people just seemed to be really comfortable with these topics, and I felt a bit behind. After I really, it took probably like 6 to 12 months to figure out, okay, the strategies I'm using right now are not working for me. There must be an easier way. What would this look like if it were easier? And since then, I've had this amazing realization that you never know really how smart you could be. You never know what your potential is. And I think that's one thing that I get a bit fired up about when I'm trying to explain things to other people in my videos, is there's no way of telling that you couldn't be the person who just gets 100% on everything. There's no way of you knowing what your potential is unless you really push yourself to get there. And after I tried different things out and the results just got better and better and better, then I felt the imposter syndrome went away, and I thought, you know, there are some really smart people in med, but in terms of like a combination of working smart, long, consistently, and hard, these are all controllable things. And I think I can manage with that if I just continually be passionate about the topics, do the best I can, and stay organized. And that's been a game changer for me.
Yeah, I think that's really powerful, especially saying that you never where your potential is or where your true final, 100% actually is. You can never find that out because there's always a little bit more that you can do. And, saying that you can't is kind of selling yourself short always.
So you've mentioned a lot about your friends and doing study by yourself and also with others. How have the people around you influenced how you study?
One of the best parts about med for me is the people that you meet. You get to meet a bunch of people from different fields, really, and people who come from different backgrounds, with different styles, but who are intelligent, well-spoken, extremely kind. And even though I'm a person who likes to do a lot of studying myself, I do believe a lot in the sense of that you're the sum of the people you spend the 5 most time around. And so if you surround yourself with people who are, focused on becoming good doctors and knowing the content well and then being thorough, I think the expectations and the standards that you have for yourself rise. I'm tremendously lucky to have a group of friends from high school to uni who were net givers, in the sense that they would always share tips, resources. It wasn't a toxic competitive environment that you might think with ATAR and in some other courses sometimes it can be. And that's been quite found for me and sort of inspired me to try and be a bit more of a net giver with the sort of studying that I do. Because there's always going to be people who, take notes in class and distribute them. And you can sort of be a consumer or you can be a giver in that sense. But to spend time with other high achieving people is one of the key factors that I think contributes to my motivation and has also inspired me to try and, help others and to push each other, because I think the more you push your friends and the colleagues around you, the better you'll end up being as well. So it's something that you can do for selfless reasons, but ends up having that rebound effect on yourself too.
And how did you have the motivation to keep on going with your studies?
Motivation's a tricky one, because in some areas I feel like I have lots of it, and in some areas I just can't be bothered. And if I had more motivation, I could learn so many more things. So it's always a thing that I wish I had more of, but on the other hand, you have to learn to manage whether you have it or don't. So when I do feel more motivated is generally after I spend time with friends or after I watch like a movie about some smart person and I feel like I've got to do more work, or after I read a book. And in those cases, like when I have the motivation, when I'm feeling fired up, I just go hard and do a lot of work and use that motivation to try and get more output. But most of the time, I don't really feel motivated to learn a topic. I do it through because I have to, and because I try and have goals that I do each day. And I just try and gradually, day on day, chip away at that. So whether I feel like it or not, I'll get my questions done that day. I'll get my Anki done. And so you need to have a strategy that works with motivation and without, but also to design your life to have these spurts of motivation. And so you have source of inspiration. And then when you have one, to really channel it into whatever topic you are motivated towards. So sometimes if I'm reading a book on physics, I'll be like, oh, this is the greatest thing ever. And then I'll go watch, Neil deGrasse Tyson's documentaries or read a new book. And then other times, like now, I'm like, oh, I have no real interest in pursuing these topics. So unfortunately, and I think one of the challenges of school or even early uni is you don't really get to choose what you learn. And it's hard to be passionate about things that are sort of forced upon you. But if you really ask the deep questions, if you learn through curiosity and not through necessity, you can create a passion or create an interest in the topic that you're learning about, and then you can make it fun for yourself. And if you can try and create your own motivation rather than assuming the motivation comes first, I think often the aim comes first, and then you get inspiration from the aim and that turns into motivation. I think that's from Simon Sinek. So you have a purpose to the studying. Your purpose is you're going to do well in the exams, you're going to be a good doctor, you're going to be competent with patients. Because you're studying for the purpose, that will give you some inspiration. You need to learn these things, and it's important. You'll see that you're gradually improving with the flashcards and the questions that you're doing. And then you can use all that for motivation. Like if I get this done 30 minutes a day, I've already done, you know, so many hours, and then you can use that to gradually keep on building and then turn things into passion. So rather than starting from a place of passion, which is, I think, which would be lovely, we have to cultivate the passion with the work we do and create our own inspiration for ourselves and for others.
I think you also mentioned stuff about making your studying fun. How do you go about doing that?
I like to make it short and sharp. So all my Anki cards are very brief because I don't really enjoy reciting long things. I like to change tasks quite often, so I don't really spend more than half an hour doing Anki practice questions or revision. I like to sort of balance things. So I'll do a bit of practice questions. When I'm getting tired of that, then I'll switch to some Notion, and then I'm tired of that, I'll switch to something else. I'd try and gamify the flashcards or the practice questions, and even though like these numbers have no significance, I try and maintain a certain level of standard there. And I find that I genuinely enjoy trying to explain concepts to people. I think there's lots of misconceptions that go around, and when you see these questions like problem solving or like solving a murder mystery, in the sense that you have all these clues that you need to put together, rather than I have to just learn this topic and recite it to my pillow, then it's a completely different game that you're playing with yourself. So I find practice questions are a lot more fun than textbook reading or making notes. And then really the purpose of the notes and learning is to just help me and give me a hint for those practice questions. And so the transition from notes and textbooks to practice questions and flashcards has made things a lot more enjoyable for me.
I think you've already talked a lot about this, but some people watching this might look at it and think that, you know, you've always been a genius, it all came easy to you. What do you say to that?
It's something that's like impossible to convince people about, when people like, oh, you must have always been like getting these crazy scores. No one will ever believe that, you know, I felt like I was, you know, basically an average med student in first year. My results weren't particularly good. I could show you my year 9 report cards and they were basically, you know, average or slightly above average. To me, I never really had that person prompting me to say like, why couldn't you just be better? And I think while lots of people believed in me, I didn't have the self-belief until it almost happened by accident. But I found that probably around year 11, the more I seemed to work on things, the earlier I seemed to prepare, then what I thought was possible just kept getting broken down. It started off with aiming for 90% in certain tests. And once I cleared that, I thought, oh, what about 95%? And then what about 99%? And even in med, it was just the same cycle that repeated. You know, I started off in the 80s, and then there were these mentions of people who were getting 95s. And you're like, how on earth is that possible? To know so much about, this is all of biochemistry that we've learned, and they're getting 95%, which is crazy. And then you push yourself, and then, you know, I hit 90s the next year, and I was like, oh, like, this is possible. And then eventually passed the 95s, and then why can't I, now I'm at the stage where I'm realistically thinking, if I get everything right, I could realistically get 100% on like all of these questions, because I can have the system of learning things. And I honestly think everyone can as well. I don't think it's something that is restricted to people of a certain IQ or people who work a certain amount of hours. I honestly think if you study in a smart way, in a consistent way, regardless of your talent, if you just put in and learn all the best strategies to studying and focused your effort, had a good team of people around you who you could study with or learn from, then I think everyone can actually get that same mark. And it's very hard, because when you do well, people will start detaching themselves from you a little bit. They'll start just to think, oh, you're sort of made of something different. But I think the people who get there, like if you spoke to all the top 10 people in med, they're all sort of just regular people. They're just the same as the rest of us. It's just they just do a little bit more, or they study in a slightly different way. They're just good at a lot of different skills rather than genetically supreme people who have these photographic memories. I'm still yet to see someone who can just look at a page and just absorb the whole thing. It really just is, you know, can you just be consistent and work smart over a long period of time? And I think whether that's you in high school or you in university now, everyone can flip the switch and really push the top of their year level just by making a conscious decision on, I'm going to change how I'm studying, and I'm not going to set limits on myself, and I'm just going to push until I eventually plateau. And in my experience, you only plateau because you can't go above 100%. And essentially it is like, I feel like you could still learn more and more and more, but sometimes like once you reach a certain level, it's just, they might just give you one or two ridiculous questions that it was impossible to know, or it might just be a 50-50 that dictates your luck. And eventually once you hit, I think, above 95%, your score on the exam is not actually a reflection of how well you know the topic. It's just a reflection of what the exam day was like and whether the luck was on your side or not. And once you've hit that level, then you're sort of above the exams, I think. And you either need harder things or to take on a different channel.
I think that's a really, really nice way to end things off, and to realize that, you know, you can just keep pushing yourself, keep doing better and better, and aiming to do better, because, you know, you can and you should try to do that. I guess to finish things off, if you had to do it all over again, you had to give yourself, you know, one piece of advice, what would that be?
I think I've never regretted working hard at something. I know that is a common regret of people at the end of their life is, I wish I worked too hard. To me, it's opened up opportunities that I didn't know existed previously, whether that's research, scholarship, you know, connections with other high achieving people. But within all that hard work, I think the thing that I would go back and tell myself is that the relationships that you have need effort and they need to be cultivated, and to not wait and expect people to make the first move, to be the leader in that sense. So to encourage my former self to be the person who, you know, asks people to hang out, or be the person who organizes events, to put effort into those relationships, because they're the things that matter at the end of the day. Whether you get 80% or 90%, who cares? I think the statement is right. Like, I don't remember any maths class I've been to. I don't really remember any study session I've done, or have any even the pleasure of any academic achievement sort of pales in comparison to the moments I've had, like playing sport, hanging out with friends, traveling, having an adventure. And obviously these study things are important, but they are really just a way to optimize your time and free up more time for the passions and hobbies that you have, and spending time with other people. And I think that's important to maintain from the get-go.
That's so true, Ethan, and that's like one of the main reasons that I started this channel as well, because I feel it's so important to be able to spend your time productively in order to free up your time to do whatever it is that you want. And that's always going to be useful in spending time with your friends, doing things that you like, and spending your time in a way that's meaningful to you. So I think that's so important. Thanks so much for coming on, Ethan. It was really good to have you.
It's been a pleasure. Thanks very much, Emil.
Thank you so much for watching this video with Ethan. Make sure to give him some love on his YouTube channel and consider watching this video next. Let me know if you've enjoyed this format and if you'd like to see more of it. And as always, thank you so much for watching.